Alright guys, we're back for part 2 of the fishing worms for steelhead. We're going to talk now about jigs and worms under a float, because this is another effective presentation for where you possibly have more suspended fish. And personally, just like bobber dogging, I love when you can see a bobber go down. I am very visual when I fish, and I love being able to know for sure that bobber's under the water, that's a bite. Not anything to have to worry about a feel or touch. I just think it just adds to me back to where I was a kid, watching those trout just slam those floats under the water. So really all you're doing here is your typical setup. You have a float of some sort, but you have a bobber stop up on the top end. You have a protective bead. This happens to be just a soft bead. You can run a corky for contrast. Pick your favorite float. This happens to be a 20-gram Cleardrift. Then we're going to run another bumper bead to protect the float itself. Then an inline sinker in this case. This is the big difference between bobber dogging, is you're running an inline float sinker. This happens to be 3/8 because a 20-gram is a ½ ounce float. So with the 3/8 weight, about 3 feet of 10-pound test leader down to your jig. And one of the things here with the jigs is I really feel with the pink worm you can get away with using a normal jig. It'll work. Some worms are not as dense, and so when you have that jig and the worm together, the current or a missed hook set will pull that worm off. Now you can go ahead and use something like a bait button to keep that worm secure, which I'd recommend. But there are other things out there that can help in addition to a bait button to keep that worm on. And what I'm talking about here is, we'll get close, that little wire keeper. So there's some great manufacturers out there that make these kinds of jigs. You're looking at bobber down steelhead jigs. Gordon makes some awesome ones. He even has a dropper head with the worm keeper as well. You can also go B&R Tackle has these. A lot of different manufacturers now are making them. So really all preference, but I have found because of that little keeper, your worm really stays well on the hook. Now there's a couple different sizes. You can go a 1/4 ounce like this guy here, which is going to be your more higher turbulent water. Let's say ahead of a run that needs to get this jig down right away. This would be a perfect one for that. Or maybe your water's up a little bit and you're a little bit higher current flow. Maybe you need a bigger profile because your water clarity has 1 foot to 1.5 feet of visibility. Something like this is what you want to go with. If you're looking for more of just a typical steelhead green, 2.5 to 3 feet of visibility, even more, your 1/8 ounce is perfect size. Now when it comes to worms, just like in the last video, Cleardrift makes them. There's so many different manufacturers out there. Mad River, shoot, Xfactor Tackle has some great ones. Guys, it's just a preference base, and they all have their own unique designs. Paddle tails versus slim down. I mean, the one thing that I really like about the Xfactor one is you see it right here, I'm barely even doing anything, and that is moving all over the place. That tapered tail in the water really works well. There's another one. This one happens to be Mad River, the Peachy Pearl, and that's a Yakima bait maxi jig head you can buy. But you can see there I have a bait button to keep this all squared away. So what it looks like when you have everything together, you're running your main line to your float, to your weight, all the way down to your jig. And what we're going to do with this one, we're going to take an 1/8 ounce jig and I'm going to put this Nightmare Xfactor one that I got here. So you got to kind of eyeball it. So if the jig here is going to sit about that on the body itself, I take the hook point and I make just a little mark so I know exactly where that needs to go. Now what I will do then, take the hook point, find my mark, and we're going to go down to it, trying to go center of the worm as much as possible. You get to your mark, slowly push it. Now this is where that keeper you see on the front end comes into play, because I will go push that up and over the keeper and the rest of the worm will follow. And just like that, you now have perfectly rigged tail ready to go. For added protection of the worm itself, drop down a bait button, which is just a little sweet rubber disc there, and you're ready to rock. Now, one little tip as you're float fishing anything jig wise, but worms in particular, because they weigh more, it's going to want your rig to lay like that. You want to try and have as much as possible your jig laying forward. So I don't know if you guys can see, but I have two knots on there. One that I cut off there in the front and the one that's tied to the actual leader. So what I'll do is I will push forward that original knot. Because of the weight of this, it's not going to exactly go right now, but this is going to sit better in the water as it fishes, because you have that jig, as they call it, cocked. As opposed to if I pulled this straight up and down, it's going to fish this way. You want as much as possible for that jig to look horizontal in the water. With the current, it's going to lift this up and it's going to fish effectively. So that's really a couple ways you can put a worm on the jig and fish them effectively. Many of you may have seen, this was my whacker, I guess you could call it, this season. This Xfactor Tackle peach worm, the pink head, little red Sharpie to the tail. This thing was definitely killing it. And while we're still on the float subject here, I think it's a great way to bring about one additional way you can rig a worm for float fishing. Now, this in particular is something that, just like in the bobber dogging video, can be deadly. What I'm talking about here is wacky rigging a 3 or 4 inch worm with a bait weight underneath. So all it is, 4 inch worm rigged wacky style, but instead of that cheater being a floating, this one happens to be a bait weight. And additionally, there's a little tiny 4mm bead there to help the whole rig stay straight up and down. So it's rigged the same way like you do for the bobber dogging a wacky rig, and that's all we're using there. Just the 1/8 ounce side UV bait weight. Different presentation through a hole, wacky rig style, fishes up and down just like this, under your float, but just as effective is a horizontally presented jig, just like we showed here. So thank you so much for watching today, guys. Really hope you learned a lot. Just some simple ways to float fish a worm, and we'll really dive into some new stuff here coming soon. enjoy a couple pictures and give us a thumbs up if this is what kind of stuff you want to see. If you want to see more, comment below. Would love to hear your guys' thoughts on what you want to see us to put together. And we'll see you guys out on the water. So thanks a lot. Take care and fish on.